welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's great to have you with us. This week we're looking at another reading from Mark's Gospel in which two stories of healing and wholeness are sandwiched together. We'll explore those and think a bit about what they might say to us today. But before we dive into that, if you haven't done so already, you may find it helpful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, the link for which you can find just below the video in YouTube. On the sheet, you will find the text of the reading that we're looking at, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering later on, and plenty of space for you to bring your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado, let's take a look at today's text, which comes from Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. Jesus and his disciples had been spending time in the Decapolis, the 10 towns, which were not Jewish territory. And Jesus had caused controversy there, as we find out in verses 1 to 20 of this chapter, by casting out a demon of somebody who had been possessed for a long time and then driving those demons into a herd of pigs that ran into the sea and were drowned. So he and his disciples, having been begged to leave, have come back across the Sea of Galilee to Jewish territory, to what we take to be Capernaum. And it seems that large crowds who had gathered around Jesus previously, as we learn in chapter 4, had come back perhaps in even greater numbers than previously. And we know that those people who'd come to surround Jesus were packing in so tightly it was hard for Jesus and his friends to move. The disciples at this point included more than the 12, we know that from earlier on in the Gospel, but we're also beginning to see Peter, James and John marked out as Jesus' inner circle, his closest friends. And in verse 37, as we'll see when we look more at today's reading, they are the ones who are permitted to come and witness Jesus healing Jairus' daughter. Jairus was the president of one of the local synagogues in Galilee, and his 12-year-old daughter we're told, was ill to the point of death. In the midst of this story, we also have the professional mourners who were present at Jairus' house, as was very common at that time. People didn't kind of hide away from death or push it sort of into the privatized realm, as we tend to do nowadays. Professional mourners, being present and wailing and weeping, gave those who'd been bereaved, I guess, the space and freedom to express their own feelings very publicly. And they weren't particularly impressed with Jesus, as we'll see. And in our other account of healing and wholeness, besides that about Jairus' daughter, we have a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhaging, from menstrual bleeding, for 12 long years. And it's interesting that her name is not actually known to us, suggesting that she wasn't, perhaps unlike Jairus, known to the early church. Mark's Gospel was the first to be written around 65 to 70 of the Common Era, and today's passage, as I've already indicated, reflects one of his characteristic storytelling methods of sandwiching two accounts together. There are some Old Testament passages it's useful for us to have in mind before we make our Mark's Gospel sandwich. So firstly, we might turn to Leviticus, to chapter 12, verses 1 to 8, and chapter 15, verses 25 to 30. They show us the purity laws that marked a woman suffering from the kind of hemorrhaging that the woman in this story would have done as ritually unclean, as perpetually unclean. It was the convention that a woman who was having her period was considered to be unclean, and she was unclean for 7 days afterwards and had to go through various rituals in order to be fully welcome again. It illustrates that taboo, actually, that often meant women weren't treated in that society with the respect they deserved. There are other healing stories it's helpful for us to keep in mind. So, for example, in 1 Kings 17, verses 17 to 24, and in 2 Kings 4, verses 18 to 37, we've got stories of healings performed by two of the great Old Testament prophets, Elijah and Elisha. And these stories would have been well known to the people gathered around Jesus. And finally, it's useful for us to note that in Matthew 9, verses 18 to 26, and in Luke 8, verses 41 to 56, we find two later versions of this same story. Matthew's version being notably abbreviated, and Luke's version telling us some details we perhaps don't get from Mark. So we've set the scene. Let's look more at the passage. Both these stories emphasize for us the importance of faith in Christ. They're both stories that focus on women who are beyond medical help, and they show Jesus touching those who were regarded as ritually unclean, and thus breaking deep cultural taboos in the process. The level of faith that Jairus shows here in being certain that Jesus can help is a real contrast to the lack of trust the disciples showed in the passage we looked at in last week's study, specifically chapter 4, verses 35 to 41, when a storm was whipped up on the lake at Galilee and the disciples were in trouble. And there's a steady progression of faith that we therefore see here, from the disciples' lack of faith to the the demons recognising who Jesus is, but nothing more than that, to the woman who hoped Jesus would be able to cure her hemorrhaging, and right the way through to Jairus, who was certain that Jesus could help his daughter. And the sandwiching of these two stories together really helps to build up the dramatic tension that we see as events reach their conclusion. So let's look at our first slice of bread in our Mark's Gospel sandwich, verses 21 to 24, and Jesus is being approached by Jairus. Jairus, being the president of a synagogue, might sound like a really grand title. We find verse 22. But in a small town with only a few people in it, it perhaps wasn't as grandiose as it sounds. But he would have nonetheless been an important local figure. It's quite likely that Jairus was somebody who found Jesus' being present in his area quite challenging. He was stirring up trouble. He was revealing himself as one who could do things only God was supposed to be able to do. He was teaching things that were controversial. Perhaps ordinarily Jairus might have wanted to avoid Jesus. But as we learn in verse 23, his daughter's illness was life-threatening. It made him one of the very few Jewish leaders to seek Jesus out. And it's interesting, the only other character in the whole of Mark's Gospel who seeks Jesus out and whose name we know is Bartimaeus. And that's in chapter 10, verse 46. Jairus was so desperate, we're told in verse 22, that he threw himself at Jesus' feet. He prostrated himself before him. Indeed, the word that's used is the same word that's used for worship. And I suspect it would have made some people sneer, despite some commentaries saying it was a mark of respect. It certainly wasn't the dignified behaviour one would expect from a synagogue president. Jesus recognises the urgency of the situation. And it's interesting that Jairus' prayer about his daughter being healed and made whole in verse 23 could be translated equally well as "so that my daughter may be saved and gain eternal life," because the Greek words for save and for heal are the same, so there's a bit of wordplay going on. Jesus recognises the urgency of the situation, as I say, and follows Jairus through a crowd that was pressing in very tightly and making it difficult to make rapid forward progress towards his house. That brings us to the filling of our Mark's Gospel sandwich, which takes us from verse 25 to verse 34. And that's the story of the healing of the woman who'd experienced hemorrhaging. As we talked about already a bit, women were regarded as unclean during their periods and for a week after. And this menstrual taboo, which arguably goes back to Genesis chapter 3 verse 16 and the curse God appears to put on Eve, explains why women were often sidelined and why this woman's ordinary daily life would have been taken away from her, basically. The Levitical purity laws that we've already mentioned would have made her a social outcast. And her situation would have been incredibly painful and exhausting, as she would have been dealing with constant anemia. We're told that she had spent all that she had pretty much on doctors and others who tried to cure her, but nothing had worked. And in many ways, I kind of think Jesus was her last resort. Everything that she touched as one who was bleeding, and everyone that she touched would have been made unclean in that belief system. So she really had no life to speak of. And it explains, I think, why she chose to use the cover of the crowd to approach Jesus, because she couldn't have been seen to do so publicly. That's what we learn in verses 27 to 28. And verse 33 shows just how scared she was when her presence was revealed. Now in chapter 6, verse 56 of Mark's Gospel, we find others who were healed by just touching Jesus' clothing, like the woman here. You have that detail in verses 28 and 30. So it's not the first time we hear of this in Mark's Gospel. But there's a really, I suppose, quite sweet exchange Jesus has with his disciples in verses 30 to 31, where he basically looks around and says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples point out that, well, with so many people around, what kind of question is that? For Tom Wright, in his commentary, that points to the historicity of the events that we're looking at here. Jesus responds to this woman when she reveals herself and tells the whole truth about what's happened, not by condemning her like she feared, but by calling her daughter. And that implies that a relationship had been formed between the two because of her actions. And the acknowledgement that Jesus gave her set her free socially as well as physically. She now had her life back in its wholeness. Her faith that had made her well, in verse 34, created space for Jesus' power to bring about healing and salvation. And indeed, the Greek word that's used for heal is again the same one that's used for saved. So Jesus' response to her could equally have been rendered, "Your faith has brought you salvation, be cured from your sickness." So it's a really quite remarkable story. And by sandwiching it in between the two bits about Jairus' daughter, it gives time for the dramatic tension to build. And sadly also time, it seems, for Jairus' daughter to have succumbed from her illness. It was believed that only God could raise the dead. And so it explains the reaction when Jesus and his disciples finally pushed their way through the crowd and have made it there, with people saying, "Well, she's dead already, don't bother the teacher, there's nothing else that he can do." Jairus, however, must have had, I think, a spark of faith, because Jesus tells him, "Trust, believe, don't worry." And so they keep going, as we learn in verse 36. Jesus somehow managed, we don't know how, to hold those vast crowds who were with him back from coming into the house. And so it's only his inner circle, Peter, James and John, who are able to enter with him, as we learn in verse 37. And we know that Jairus' parents were the only others to witness this remarkable event. So we've got the inner circle who witnessed the transfiguration, who witnessed Gethsemane, and the parents and Jesus. And that was it in the daughter's room. But before he could get that far, however, he had to deal with the professional mourners who'd already gathered there, as we learn in verse 38, and were not impressed by Jesus saying she's not dead, she's only asleep, in verse 40. Now, talking about someone being asleep was a euphemism for talking about they died. So it reflects a kind of common cultural idiom in that time. And by touching the girl, as we learn Jesus did in verse 41, by taking her hand, he broke the taboos around death, around touching dead bodies. And his command to her to get up, to wake up, comes to us in the original Aramaic, which I think again perhaps points to the historicity. And it shows a really personal warmth. Just as Jesus had obviously formed a relationship with the woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhaging, so he showed personal warmth and a connection with this girl. And the words that are used for arise and get up are again the words used for resurrection. So it points us forward to Easter and to Jesus' own resurrection. There's deliberate ambiguity that is created here. And it's interesting that unlike the healings of Elijah and Elisha, in 1 Kings and 2 Kings respectively, Jesus didn't need to pray here. His word was enough. We're told in verse 42 that the girl was 12 years old. Now, in that culture, it meant that she was of marriageable age. Effectively, she was a young woman. And there were conventions around how men and women were meant to interact with one another. So Jesus also breaks those conventions in relation to men and women and touch in order to set this girl free. And after this has happened, Jesus swears the parents and his close disciples to secrecy, which I suspect would have been impossible given the large crowds who presumably would have soon figured out what happened. And he also tells her, in a real care for her physical needs, tells the parents to give this girl something to eat. So there's an awful lot going on in these two stories. And I think the significant thing for us today is the holding together of healing and salvation and resurrection. It's very easy to misunderstand what we mean by both healing and salvation, and particularly to think of the latter as pie in the sky when you die, as escaping from this world and getting to heaven. And that's not what's going on here. Jesus shows that salvation, wellness, wholeness in body as well as mind and spirit is something for the here and now as well as on into eternity. And for me, that's the key that unlocks what Mark's doing here as he makes this gospel sandwich.